Let's talk about scope. What is a scope? Scope indicates where in the code a variable can be used. And also we can say that the variable defined in a function can be used inside this function, and which variables we create in the main body, those can be used everywhere in this code or in this file. And we can say that those belong to global scope. So it is possible to use and change the global variables inside the function, but it's not recommended. And during this course, we don't want you to do that. So there are other ways to solve those problems if you want to change some value of a variable and so on. Let's see a code example. So here we have a bunch of code. It doesn't make a lot of sense, but the idea is that we have different kind of structures from the code, and here we can see where the variable has effect and where it has not. And I've used Python tutor, one website where we can see how the code is executed and how what steps are taken to get some results and so on. So here we have the same code, and those arrows here indicate where in the code we are currently, which line is to be executed and so on. So we have variable a. It's also shown here that we have global frame where the a value is 0. Let me make it larger. And we now are executing the line if a is equal to 0. And we can here go step by step. We take the next step in this code. Because the a value is 0, we go inside this if statement, and here we see that the b value becomes 1. And now we define a function. So just here in the code we define function which has the name myFunction. It takes one argument, which is c, and it does something. So let's see what it does. Now the myFunction is defined and it's stored inside the memory. So there is basically a variable myFunction which indicates or points to a function. And now we execute this function. Because this myFunction points to a function, Python understands that now it has to execute this function, and the 7 or the value is passed to this function. And now the execution goes into this function. And we can see the red arrow here indicates which line is to be executed next. Now we are inside this myFunction, and we have a kind of a different frame or different set of variables we can use here. We can use all the global values or global variables, but we can also use values or variables from this function. So what we have here, we have variable c, which has the value 7. The variable c is actually kind of declared with this parameter here. The code or the 7 is passed into this c, and that's the reason why the c has value 7. Now we declare a variable d, which has a value of 3, and we print out both c and d. So the printout is shown here. So we printed out 7 and we printed out 3. Now the function body ends. So the execution of the function ends. It actually returns none. It's not written here, but if you don't return anything in Python from the function, the default is none. So basically none is returned. And now if we go next, this d and c values are kind of lost from the memory because there is no point to hold them. The function execution ended, and now we can print out the a and b values. So basically we get 0 and 1, and the printing out of c and d is commented out because I would get an error. But if I want to print out the value of C, there is no C value. Although if you check the code, or maybe D is a better example. So in the code, I have a line which says that the value of D will become 3. But here, if I want to print it out, I would get an error. The reason behind that is the scope for this variable is this function. So if the function ends, the variable kind of doesn't exist anymore, as we can see here. There is no variable D in the memory anymore, so I cannot print it out. And that's the end of this, this code, so nothing else happens here. Here are some comments about the same execution. And yeah, the idea is that A and B values are global, they are accessible, and I cannot get C or T because those are inside the function and they are lost after the function. So let's see what's the local scope. Variables created in the local scope cannot be used in a global scope. So for example, I have a function foo, which creates a variable par. Now if I call the foo, the code execution goes into this function. Variable par will be created, but this is only for the local scope. So only inside the foo function I can use this variable. Here I would get an error because I cannot print out the variable from another scope. A global variable. Global variables can be used inside a local scope. So for example, I have a function f which does something, and here I give a value of 5. Let's see the visualization here. So we have a function f and we have global variable a. We can see that the name f points to this function f. I can see that the a variable has a value of 5, and now we go inside this function. We want to print out the result of the function, but because we cannot print out the value without knowing the value, we first have to calculate the value, or we have to see what the function gives us. So we go into this f function. And if we go here, we pass on a value of 3, which will be stored in variable x. This is the parameter here. And now, if we go next, you can see that this function returns x plus a. The value of x is 3. This comes from the function call, but the value of a from the global scope is 5. So here we can see that 3 plus 5 is 8, and this is what is returned. The idea here is that inside functions you can use global variables, but it's not recommended. It's very easy to make mistakes in this way. So rather, everything you want to use inside a function, pass it on as arguments. So for example, in this case, we can have a second argument here or second parameter here. And here, if I call it out, I can pass 2 values, 3 and 5, for example. So in local scope, variables from other local scopes cannot be used. So for example, I have 2 different functions, foo and par. Inside foo, I create a variable dog, which gets a value of 5. Now I call a function bar. And the question is, what happens? Let's draw it here. I have a function of foo. I call it f and b. Now inside the foo, I will have a variable of d, and it becomes 5. Now I call out the function bar from here, and I print out the value of dog. The b is print here. I have shortcuts or shorter versions of every variable and so on. And inside the bar function, we have the value of something else. And now we call out function f. What happens? First we go here, we execute this line, and let's say the d value inside memory is 5. Now I come here to this b function, but because this variable d is kept in this local scope, I will have a different d variable which points to 3, 3, 3. And now if the b execution is ended, basically this variable is lost from the memory. But it doesn't overwrite this value here. So if I end this call here, the b function is executed, everything is done. I come here, I print out the value of d, and it takes it from the local scope. So it takes the 5 and prints out the 5. Then we can see the visualization also from this Python tutor. Here we can see that we execute the foo function. We go inside the foo, and we are inside the foo now. The variable of dog becomes 5, so everything is understandable. Now we go into function bar, and inside function bar we have a different local scope. And as you can see, there is a different variable dog with different value. And after the b is finished, or the function execution is finished, this dog just is erased from the memory. So there is no bar local scope anymore. So therefore there is no dog value or dog variable for this bar scope. We are left with this foo local scope. And also what can be seen is that we always have only one active local scope where we are actually in currently. Even if we were inside the foo is kept on hold, or it waits until we finish this bar. And after we have finished the bar, then we go back to this active scope here. And now the dog value is taken from the local scope. The value is 5 and it's printed out. That's how it works. So changing a global variable. A global variable can be changed inside a local scope using a global statement. So for example, we have this foo function, and inside the function we want to change the cheese value to 3. To do that, we have to have a statement global here. What it does, it actually makes this cheese variable writable. So writable, I can write over the value of cheese. And how it works. First if you execute the code, first the foo function is loaded into the memory. Now the cheese variable is stored in memory. Now we go into foo. Inside foo, the global statement says that this cheese now becomes writable in our function, and if I write or assign new value to this variable, it's overwritten, or the value is actually changed. And if I print it out here, the value becomes 3. Yeah, we have this visualization also. So we start with the value of cheese, which is 0, then we go into foo. Now the global statement is executed. Now if I change the cheese value, you can even see that cheese is not even inside this foo scope. What happens is that the value is overwritten or changed here. And the foo execution is finished, nothing is returned, and now the cheese value is changed for the global scope. The problem is that if one function changes values of the global scope, there is no kind of overview, or there is no guarantee that you don't break anything. If, for example, there is a huge system which does something, for example, booking for a hotel or something like that, and you as the programmer have to write a new function which just, I don't know, finds the most suitable client or most, I don't know, client who hasn't booked for several days, so you can write or give some pointers what you book. And now the problem is that if inside your function you change, for example, for whatever reason, you change the name of the hotel with a global statement, maybe you can do it. It depends how the code is written. This makes everything break, probably. Maybe not, but there are certainly cases where you can break everything because you change the global variable. So usually we say that don't change global variables, don't even use global variables inside a function. For that you can pass on arguments and change or do something with those arguments. But we will see those in more detail when we see how to write functions and so on. So the summary for scope. Scope indicates what part of the code the variable exists or where it can be used. Variables which we declare inside a function cannot be used outside. Global variables are actually accessible everywhere in the code, but if you want to really change the values, you have to use global statement. But this is not recommended. This often makes your code break, and then you can have outcomes which you don't expect. Using and especially changing the global variables is not recommended. And I will just point out again that inside this function, inside this course, we don't allow it to do. So if there is a special case where you have to do it, we will say it specially, but otherwise don't use global statement, don't use global variables. And all those values you want to get for a function, you should pass on as arguments. So there is no limit. You can have 2 arguments, you can have 3, and so on. So if you want to have three different values which you will use inside your function, just use those 3 parameters where you can pass on those 3 values and calculate something based on them. Don't use global variables.